Two respected men, David Wilson and Chris Harris, were driving through a quiet neighborhood when their night took a sudden and unexpected turn. Without cause, they were pulled over by two officers. But what unfolded after the stop was nothing short of shocking. What happens when the police discover their true identities? Let's find out. But first, where are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments below. It was a calm evening, the kind where the hum of passing cars was the only sound to break the stillness. David, a community leader, was behind the wheel with his friend Chris, a renowned professor, riding alongside him. They had just left a charity event and were driving in comfortable silence. Out of nowhere, flashing police lights filled the rearview mirror. "Why are we being pulled over?" Chris asked, confusion written across his face. They hadn't broken any traffic laws. "I have no idea," David replied, pulling over with a sigh, already sensing the familiar tension. Despite his role as a respected man in his community, David knew the uneasy reality of being a black man behind the wheel. Two officers, including a younger, brash officer named O'Connor, approached their vehicle. Without explaining the reason for the stop, O'Connor harshly demanded, "License and registration." David, maintaining his composure, handed over his ID and documents. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked politely. O'Connor barely looked at the ID before turning to Chris, demanding his identification as well. Sensing the unjust nature of the stop, Chris hesitated, but eventually handed over his ID with a frown. As the officers glanced at the IDs, they failed to recognize who David and Chris really were. Officer O'Connor exchanged a glance with his partner, Officer Price, before stepping back to whisper something. With no hint of recognition, O'Connor suddenly ordered, "Step out of the vehicle!" David's chest tightened. "Officer, can you explain why we were stopped?" he asked calmly. "You're acting suspiciously," O'Connor snapped, reaching for his handcuffs. David and Chris exchanged worried glances. "This is wrong," Chris muttered, but David knew better than to escalate the situation. Without resistance, both men slowly stepped out of the car. In moments, they were handcuffed and standing under the harsh glare of the police car's lights. The quiet evening had taken a turn, and now they stood facing the humiliation of being treated like criminals. Minutes ticked by as the officers ran their IDs, leaving David and Chris standing by the roadside, their hands cuffed behind their backs. "Why did they stop us?" David asked quietly, frustration creeping into his voice. "We didn't do anything wrong." Chris shook his head, visibly irritated. "I don't know, but something's not right here." As the officers returned, O'Connor stepped forward, his expression hardened. Without explanation, both men were forced against the car, their movements careful and deliberate. David, ever calm, asked, "Officer, can you tell us what this is about?" O'Connor's flat response was chilling. "You're acting suspiciously." The younger officer's tone was sharp, dismissing any protest. He quickly slapped the cuffs onto David's wrists, while Officer Price did the same to Chris. The passing cars slowed down, their drivers gawking at the scene unfolding on the side of the road. Two successful men, reduced to suspects without cause. As they stood there, cuffed, the weight of their reality hit hard. They hadn't done anything wrong, but the color of their skin had once again made them targets. The frustration, fear, and anger began to boil beneath the surface, but they knew that protesting too much could make the situation worse. Officer Price, watching from a distance, began to sense that something wasn't right about the stop. As he ran their IDs again, the truth of who David and Chris were slowly emerged. David wasn't just any civilian, he was a police captain. When Officer Price realized this, the mood shifted dramatically. Something about the situation didn't sit right with Officer Parker. He walked back to the patrol car and ran David Wilson's ID through the police database. As the results flashed on the screen, his heart skipped a beat. His eyes widened in shock, and he quickly glanced back at David, who stood by the roadside still in handcuffs. Parker rushed over to Officer Cole and whispered urgently, "Do you know who that is?" Cole, confused, shook his head. "No, who cares? They fit the description." "That's Captain David Wilson," Parker said, his voice barely above a whisper. "He's a high-ranking officer. He's our superior." The color drained from Cole's face as the realization hit him. His grip tightened on his flashlight, and for a moment he seemed frozen in place, overwhelmed by the weight of his mistake. He quickly motioned to Parker, and together they hurried over to David and Chris, fumbling to remove their handcuffs. We didn't know, sir," Parker stammered as he unlocked David's cuffs. "Captain Wilson, I'm so sorry. There's been a misunderstanding." David, now free, rubbed his wrists and looked at the officers with a calm but piercing gaze. His disappointment was palpable, cutting through the night more sharply than any angry outburst could have. "That's the problem," David said slowly, his voice calm but filled with authority. "You didn't ask." Officer Cole stood there, speechless, his pale face reflecting the realization of what they had done. Chris, now uncuffed as well, took a step forward. "If this is how you treat someone like him," he said, nodding toward David, "how do you treat the rest of us?" The backup officers, who had arrived prepared for confrontation, now stood awkwardly, shifting uncomfortably. They had been ready for trouble, but were instead faced with the truth that they had nearly arrested one of their own leaders based purely on assumption. As David and Chris turned to walk back to their car, David paused. He looked over his shoulder at Officers Parker and Cole, both of whom stood frozen in their guilt. "You need to think about why you treated us like this," David said, his voice steady but firm. "This isn't just about me. It's about every person who's judged before they're even heard." With that, David and Chris got back into the car, leaving the officers in stunned silence, the flashing lights still casting long shadows across the empty street. The next day, word of the arrest spread quickly through the police department. Officers whispered about how close Parker and Cole had come to a disaster, and how they had treated a respected captain like a common suspect. Officer Cole faced disciplinary action, and David himself led a meeting about racial profiling, forcing the department to confront the uncomfortable truths that had led to the incident. Later that evening, David and Chris sat together, reflecting on what had happened. Despite his rank, David realized that even he wasn't immune to the injustice so many others face daily. "This isn't over," David said softly, determined. "We have more work to do." Chris nodded. "We do. No one should have to go through that." Shaken but resolute, they vowed to continue their fight for change, knowing that the work was far from finished. The reforms initiated after Captain David Wilson's wrongful arrest sparked significant changes, but the journey to full reform was far from easy or complete. While David's efforts created a shift in how officers approached their jobs, the path to fully addressing the deep-rooted systemic issues required ongoing work. Initially, the police department saw several positive changes. The new training programs on bias, de-escalation, and community engagement helped officers better understand the diverse communities they served. Officers who had once been distant from the neighborhoods they patrolled began to build relationships with local residents, attending community events, and participating in dialogues that broke down barriers. These efforts reduced the number of unnecessary stops and helped rebuild some of the lost trust between the police and the public. Officer Cole, who had been directly involved in the incident, became one of the most active participants in these reforms. He emerged as a vocal advocate for change within the force, often speaking about his personal experience and how it opened his eyes to his own unconscious biases. Cole's transformation was a symbol of hope within the department, showing that individuals could grow and become part of the solution. Despite the progress, however, there were setbacks. Some officers resisted the changes, seeing the new policies as unnecessary or as a challenge to their authority. The culture within the department, like many across the country, was deeply ingrained with certain attitudes toward policing, and changing that culture took time. A few high-profile incidents in the following years threatened to undo some of the progress, reigniting tensions between the community and the police. Each time, David and other reform-minded leaders had to work hard to prevent backsliding, pushing for accountability and transparency. Externally, the community was divided as well. While many were encouraged by the efforts of David and others, some remained skeptical, believing that true reform would require much broader systemic changes that went beyond police training. Activists and civil rights organizations continued to push for more far-reaching reforms, including policy changes, oversight, and reallocating resources toward social services that could reduce the need for heavy policing. Captain David Wilson, along with Chris and other community leaders, understood that the road to full reform was a marathon, not a sprint. They continued advocating for deeper structural changes, such as increased civilian oversight of the police department, changes in use of force policies, and improvements in mental health and crisis intervention services. In the years that followed, the department became a model of gradual reform for other cities grappling with similar issues. While it was far from perfect, and some officers and citizens remained resistant, the changes made a tangible difference in day-to-day policing. Fewer incidents of racial profiling were reported, and community police relations improved overall. Still, David remained keenly aware that reform was an ongoing process. In his speeches and public appearances, David often said, "We're better than we were, but we're not where we need to be yet." He and Chris continued to work closely with grassroots organizations to ensure the conversation around justice, equity, and policing reform didn't fade. In the end, the reforms made a significant impact, but fully reformed was an elusive goal. It would require continuous effort, vigilance, and commitment from both law enforcement and the community to achieve lasting systemic change. Enjoying the story? Make sure to subscribe for more powerful content and stories that make you think. And don't forget to drop a comment below. Let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you.